The dining room felt hollow without Marcus's laughter echoing through it. The oak table that had witnessed 40 years of birthday celebrations, Thanksgiving feasts, and quiet Tuesday night dinners now seemed cavernous, swallowing the three of us whole despite our physical presence. I kept glancing at his empty chair, half expecting to see him there with his gentle smile and those reading glasses perched on his nose. It had been precisely 8 days since we laid my husband of 40 years to rest. 8 days since I stood at his graveside feeling as though someone had carved out my insides and left only a shell behind. Past the green beans, Veronica snapped, her voice slicing through the silence like a blade. My daughter-in-law had never mastered the art of warmth, but tonight her tone carried a particular chill that made the hair on my arm stand at attention. I reached for the serving dish, my arthritic fingers trembling slightly. The funeral had drained me more than I'd anticipated. At 73, I thought I'd prepared myself for this inevitable moment, but nothing could have readied me for the gaping void that now followed me from room to room. Daniel, my 45-year-old son, sat between us like a referee who'd already placed his bets. He hadn't met my gaze all evening, his attention glued to his wife of 18 years. The boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms now couldn't bear to look at the woman who'd bandaged his scraped knees and cheered at his soccer games. The service was lovely, wasn't it? I offered, desperate to fill the suffocating quiet. Your father would have appreciated how many people came to pay their respects. Veronica set down her wine glass with deliberate precision, the crystal clinking against the mahogany tabletop. Yes, well, that's precisely what we need to discuss with you, Eleanor. Something in her voice made my stomach twist into knots. I looked between her and Daniel, searching for any flicker of the affection that should exist between people who just shared an immeasurable loss. Instead, I found cold calculation in Veronica's hazel eyes and uncomfortable avoidance in my son's downcast face. What do you mean? I asked, though a part of me already dreaded the answer. Veronica straightened her spine, assuming the posture she reserved for delivering ultimatums. I'd seen it before when she'd explained why Daniel couldn't visit on Sundays anymore, why holiday traditions needed to be balanced between families, which somehow always meant more time with her parents in Napa Valley. Daniel and I have been talking, she began, her voice taking on that saccharine quality she used when she wanted something. Now that Marcus is gone, this house is simply going to be too overwhelming for you to manage alone. I blinked, confused. Too overwhelming? I've been maintaining this home for decades. I know which floorboards creak and which faucet drips. That's exactly the problem, Veronica continued, her mask of concern slipping to reveal something harder beneath. You're not getting any younger, Eleanor, and the upkeep on a property this size is astronomical. Daniel and I believe it would be best if you relocated somewhere more appropriate. The words landed like a physical blow. Relocated? This is my home. Marcus and I built our entire life within these walls. Daniel grew up here. Daniel finally spoke, his voice barely audible. Mom, Veronica's right. The maintenance alone will be too much for you. I'm not helpless, Daniel, I said, hearing my own voice crack. And this house your father and I saved for 15 years to afford the down payment. Every room holds memories of our life together. Veronica's expression hardened. Memories don't pay property taxes or repair roof leaks. Be reasonable, Eleanor. I stared at this woman who had systematically pushed me to the periphery of my son's life for nearly 2 decades. The woman who'd convinced Daniel that weekly phone calls to his mother were too demanding and that family traditions needed to be modernized to suit her preferences. What exactly are you proposing? I asked, feeling ice form in my stomach. We think you should consider one of those delightful retirement communities, Veronica said, as if she were granting me a tremendous favor. Somewhere with organized activities and people in your age group. It would be so much better for you than rattling around in this big empty house. I turned to Daniel, desperately hoping to see some sign of dissent. Daniel, you truly believe I should sell the house where you took your first steps, where your father and I. It makes sense, Mom, he interrupted, finally meeting my eyes with a gaze so detached it made my breath catch. And honestly, Veronica and I could really use the space. We've been discussing expanding our family, and this property has so much potential. The implication crashed over me like a winter wave. They didn't just want me gone, they wanted my home, the sanctuary Marcus and I had lovingly restored, room by room over for decades. Now that the sorrow has passed, grieve, pack your belongings, and don't return. Veronica's voice suddenly shed all pretense of civility. The house was never truly yours anyway. The Spanish term for mother-in-law rolled off her tongue with casual cruelty, as if she were discussing discarding worn-out furniture rather than disposing of her husband's mother. Daniel looked up then, and for a heartbeat, I saw something flicker in his eyes, uncertainty, perhaps even guilt. But then he smiled and nodded. She's right, Mom. This house belonged to Dad, and now it's mine. You were simply living here. I felt my world tilt on its axis. Simply living here. As if 40 years of marriage, of building a life and raising a child, amounted to nothing more than extended house-sitting. I understand, I said quietly, my voice steadier than I felt. Inside, something was fracturing not just my heart, but my entire understanding of who my son had become. I rose slowly, my legs unsteady beneath me, and climbed the stairs to the bedroom I'd shared with Marcus. Each step felt like scaling a mountain. The room still carried his scent, Old Spice, and the faintest hint of sawdust from his workshop. His reading glasses sat on the nightstand where he'd left them the evening before his heart attack. Sinking onto the edge of our bed, I stared at my reflection in the antique mirror. The woman looking back seemed older than 73, her silver hair limp and her blue eyes dulled by shock and fresh grief. In 2 weeks, I'd have to vacate this room where I'd whispered goodbye to Marcus just 8 days ago. I'd have to pack 4 decades of marriage into cardboard boxes and surrender everything to a son who just informed me I'd never truly belonged here. But as I sat in the gathering darkness, something else began to stir beneath the grief and disbelief, a small, hard kernel of determination. Marcus had always managed our finances, but he taught me to be thorough, to notice details. Tomorrow, I would begin making inquiries. I would visit the bank and start the process of understanding exactly what I was entitled to. Because if Daniel and Veronica believed they could simply erase me from existence without consequence, they were in for a profound surprise. The first step was comprehending precisely what Marcus had left behind and to whom. The morning sunlight felt different streaming through the kitchen windows as I sat alone at the breakfast table, cradling my 3rd cup of coffee. 9 days had passed since that horrific dinner, and the house felt as though it were holding its breath, waiting for me to depart. Daniel and Veronica had already visited twice to assess the space, measuring rooms and discussing renovations as if I were invisible. Yesterday, I'd overheard Veronica on her phone with a contractor, scheduling estimates for once the elderly tenant vacates. I'd spent those 9 days in a strange cocoon of numbness, mechanically sorting through belongings while trying to ignore the growing knot of anxiety in my stomach. But this morning, I finally felt prepared to address the practical matters Marcus would have expected me to handle. The drive to Meridian Trust Bank took 12 minutes through the familiar streets of our neighborhood. I'd been making this journey for over 25 years, usually with Marcus in the passenger seat managing our affairs while I waited in the car. He'd always been protective of our finances, not because he distrusted me, but because he said it was one less burden for me to carry. Now I wished I'd paid closer attention. Mrs. Patterson, the bank manager, greeted me with the carefully calibrated sympathy reserved for recent widows. Mrs. Harbison, I was so sorry to hear about Marcus. He was such a gentleman, always asking about my garden. Thank you, Helen. He spoke fondly of your roses. I settled into the chair across from her desk, my purse clutched tightly in my lap. I need to understand my financial situation. Marcus handled everything, and I'm afraid I'm quite lost." Helen's expression softened with understanding. "Of course, let me pull up your accounts." Her fingers danced across the keyboard. After a moment, her eyebrows rose slightly. "Is something wrong?" My heart lurched. Had Daniel and Veronica somehow already accessed our accounts? "Not wrong exactly," Helen said slowly. "It's just that there are quite a few accounts here, more than I anticipated." She printed a statement for our joint checking account. The balance was modest but sufficient to cover my expenses for several months if I was careful. Relief washed through me. "At least I wouldn't be destitute. There's also a savings account in both your names," Helen continued, sliding another paper across the desk. "This balance was substantially larger enough to sustain me for years if necessary." "That's wonderful," I said, feeling some tension leave my shoulders. Marcus was always diligent about saving. Yes, he was remarkably methodical, Helen agreed, but she was still frowning at her screen. "Mrs. Harbison, I'm seeing several other accounts that require verification. Some appear to be in your name exclusively." "My name only?" I echoed, confused. "That doesn't sound right." "Marcus managed all our finances," Helen typed rapidly. "According to our records, there are 4 additional accounts, 2 certificates of deposit, a money market account, and this is interesting, a trust account established 6 years ago." My head began to spin. "I don't understand. Marcus never mentioned any of this." "May I ask," Helen said carefully, "did your husband ever express concerns about your family dynamics? Sometimes clients establish separate accounts as a protective measure." The question caught me off guard. "Protective from what?" Helen hesitated, choosing her words with precision. "Sometimes when clients have complex family situations, perhaps concerns about inheritance disputes or external pressures, they take steps to ensure their spouse's financial security remains intact." I thought about Marcus's behavior over recent years, how he'd started asking pointed questions about Veronica's spending habits, how he'd grown quiet whenever Daniel mentioned their financial struggles, how he'd insisted on handling all banking personally, never allowing Daniel to accompany him even when our son offered assistance. "Can you tell me about these other accounts?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Helen printed several more pages. "The first CD has been rolling over annually for 8 years. The second was opened 4 years ago. The money market account has been receiving automatic transfers from your joint checking, small amounts, $75 here and there, but over time." She handed me the statements, the numbers blurred before my eyes. These weren't modest emergency funds. These were substantial sums, enough to purchase a home outright, enough to live comfortably for decades. "How is this possible?" I asked. "I never signed anything." "Actually, you did," Helen said gently, pulling out a file folder. "Your signature appears on all the paperwork. It seems Marcus brought you in to sign documents, likely telling you they were routine banking updates or insurance forms." I stared at the papers she showed me. There was my signature, dated and witnessed on forms I had no memory of signing. But looking at the dates, I could place some of them. The day we'd updated our address after the street names changed, the time we'd switched to a new checking account type. He never told me what I was actually signing. I whispered. "It's not uncommon," Helen said carefully. "Some spouses prefer to handle details to avoid causing stress, and legally, everything is perfectly legitimate. These accounts are genuinely yours." I tried to process what this meant. While Daniel and Veronica were measuring my kitchen and planning their renovations, while they were treating me like a burden to be discarded, I possessed resources they knew nothing about. "There's one more thing," Helen said, her voice even more cautious now. "The trust account I mentioned, it's been receiving transfers from a business account for the past 6 years. The Harbison Builders Trust. I believe that was your husband's company." "Yes, but Marcus sold the business when he retired," I said. "Daniel said the sale barely covered outstanding debts." Helen consulted her screen again. "According to our records, the business account is still active. There have been regular deposits and transfers to your trust account." "Mrs. Harbison, I think you need to speak with the business accountant. There may be more to your financial picture than you realize. I left the bank in a daze, my purse heavy with statements and printouts. Instead of driving home, I pulled into the parking lot of a small cafe and sat in my car, examining everything Helen had provided. The numbers didn't lie. Somehow, without my knowledge, Marcus had been systematically protecting me. Every account, every investment, every trust was structured to guarantee my financial independence. As I studied the trust account statements, a pattern emerged. The deposits corresponded with Daniel's visits over the past 6 years, always larger amounts after our son had asked his father for small loans, or when Veronica had hinted about their financial difficulties. Marcus had been giving our son money, but he'd been safeguarding an equal or greater amount for me, as if he'd known that someday I might need to stand on my own. My phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. Mom, Veronica found a realtor to list the house. We can start showings next week. Hope you're making progress finding a place. I stared at the message for a long moment, then looked again at the bank statements in my lap. Daniel and Veronica were so confident, so certain they held all the cards. They had no idea that their careful plans were built on a foundation they couldn't even see. Tomorrow, I would call the business accountant. I would discover exactly what else Marcus had left behind. And then I would decide what to do with the knowledge that my husband had loved me enough to ensure I'd never be at anyone's mercy. The grief remained, as fresh and sharp as ever. But underneath it, something else was growing, a quiet strength I hadn't felt in years. The accounting office of Walsh and Associates occupied a modest suite in a professional building downtown. I'd never been here before. Marcus had always handled business meetings himself, claiming the paperwork was tedious and would only give me a headache. Now I understood he'd been protecting me from more than boredom. Patricia Walsh appeared to be in her early 60s, with steel gray hair in a severe bun and sharp eyes behind rimless glasses. She'd managed Harbison Builders books for nearly 2 decades, and her expression when I'd called yesterday had been carefully neutral. Mrs. Harbison, she said, gesturing to a chair across from her cluttered desk. First, please accept my condolences. Marcus was an exceptional man and an honest businessman. I'll miss our quarterly reviews, thank you. I wish I could say I knew him as well in business as you did. I settled into the chair, my new bank statements tucked safely in my purse. I'm trying to understand my financial situation, and the bank mentioned ongoing business income that I wasn't aware of. Patricia's eyebrows rose. You weren't aware? That's unusual. Marcus spoke of you often, and I assumed. She trailed off, seeming to reconsider. Please, I need to understand what's been happening. My son tells me the business was sold years ago and barely covered its debts. Sold? Patricia looked genuinely confused. Mrs. Harbison Builders wasn't sold. It was restructured. She turned to her computer, pulling up files. 6 years ago, Marcus transferred all company assets into a trust, the Harbison Builders Trust. You're listed as the primary beneficiary. The room seemed to tilt. I'm the owner of the construction company. The trust owns it, and you own the trust. It's been remarkably successful, actually. Your husband was very selective about the contracts he accepted after restructuring smaller jobs, reliable clients, steady income rather than the boom and bust cycle of large commercial projects. She printed several pages and handed them to me. These are the profit and loss statements for the past 6 years. As you can see, the company has generated consistent revenue. I stared at the numbers, my hands trembling. The annual profits were substantial, more than enough to explain the regular deposits I'd seen in the trust account statements. But Marcus retired, I said weakly. He wasn't working anymore. He stepped back from daily operations. Yes, but he maintained oversight and handled major strategic decisions. The actual construction work has been managed by Mike Donnelly. I believe you know him, I nodded. Mike had worked for Marcus for over 25 years, starting as a young apprentice and rising to foreman. He'd been at the funeral, one of the few people who'd seemed genuinely grief-stricken. Mike has essentially been running the company for 6 years, Patricia continued. Marcus structured it so Mike receives a percentage of profits as a performance bonus, which has kept him motivated and loyal. It's been a very successful arrangement. Why didn't Marcus tell me any of this? The question emerged. As barely a whisper, Patricia hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. Mrs. Harbison, this might not be my place, but Marcus was concerned about family pressures. He mentioned that your son had been experiencing financial difficulties and that his wife had expensive tastes. Marcus worried that if the family knew about the continued business income, there would be demands and expectations that might compromise your future security. The pieces fell into place with devastating clarity. Every time Daniel had asked his father for a loan, every time Veronica had commented on how comfortable we seemed, Marcus had been calculating how to help our son without sacrificing my future independence. He was protecting me, I said, the words heavy with realization. He was protecting both of you in different ways, Patricia said gently. The loans he made to Daniel over the years were substantial, but they came from the business operating account, not your personal assets, and he was meticulous about documentation. She pulled out another file folder. These are copies of all loan agreements between the business and your son. Marcus insisted on treating them as formal transactions with payment schedules and interest rates. I opened the folder with shaking hands. Page after page of loan documents, each signed by both Marcus and Daniel. The amounts were staggering, tens of thousands of dollars over 6 years, supposedly for Daniel's various business ventures and investments. Has Daniel been making payments on these loans? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Patricia's expression grew pained. The payment schedule shows significant arrears. As of last month, the outstanding balance with accumulated interest is approximately $93,000. The number hit me like a physical blow. Daniel owed the family business, my business, nearly $100,000 while simultaneously claiming his father had left nothing but debts. What happens to these obligations now? They transfer with the business assets. As the new owner of the trust, you have the legal right to demand payment or restructure the terms as you see fit. I thought about Daniel and Veronica measuring my kitchen, planning their renovations, discussing when they could list the property. They were so confident, so certain they deserved everything Marcus had built. There is one more thing you should know, Patricia said, her voice even more careful now. Last month, your son contacted me directly. He said that with his father's passing, he'd be taking over management of the business affairs. He asked me to prepare transfer of ownership documents, and I told him I'd need written authorization from the trust beneficiary from you. He seemed surprised that you were involved in the business structure at all, so Daniel had been planning to claim the business along with the house, assuming I was too grief-stricken and naive to comprehend what was happening. The betrayal cut deeper than I'd thought possible. Patricia, I need to ask you something confidential, I said. If I wanted to maintain the current business structure with Mike continuing to manage operations, would that be feasible? Absolutely. Mike has been hoping to hear from you. Actually, he's concerned about the company's future and his own job security. If you're willing to maintain the status quo, I think you'd find him very reliable and grateful for the opportunity to continue. I gathered all the papers, my mind reeling with implications. The business was mine. The substantial debt Daniel had accumulated was real and legally enforceable, and neither he nor Veronica had any idea that their plans were built on a foundation of lies and assumptions. I'd like to schedule a meeting with Mike as soon as possible, I said. And I want to understand all my options regarding the outstanding loans, of course. Shall I call Mike this afternoon? Yes, please. And Patricia, I'd appreciate it if this conversation remained confidential for now. Absolutely. Client confidentiality is sacred in this business. As I drove home, my phone buzzed with another text from Veronica. Eleanor, The realtor wants to schedule a photographer for tomorrow. Make sure the house is clean and decluttered. First impressions matter for potential buyers. I stared at the message for a long moment before tucking my phone away without responding. Let them plan their photography session. Let them imagine their future in my house, spending money they thought they'd inherited. They had no idea the foundation they were building their dreams on was about to crumble. That evening, I sat in Marcus's study for the first time since his death, surrounded by his meticulously organized files. Now I understood why he'd been so careful about record keeping, why he'd insisted on proper documentation for every transaction. He'd been building a fortress around me, brick by brick, transaction by transaction. And tomorrow, I would discover just how strong those walls really were. Mike Donnelly's callous hands wrapped around his coffee mug as we sat in my kitchen the next morning. At 57, he still had the broad shoulders and weathered palms of a man who'd spent his life building things, but his eyes held a weariness I'd never seen before. Mrs. Harbison, I've got to be honest with you, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I've been worried sick since Mr. Marcus passed. Daniel came by the job site last week talking about evaluating assets and streamlining operations. It didn't sound good for folks like me. I poured myself another cup of coffee, using the familiar routine to steady my nerves. Mike, what exactly did my son tell you? He said the family was facing some financial difficulties, that tough decisions would need to be made about the business. He wanted me to provide a complete list of all current contracts, equipment, and cash flow projections. Mike's jaw tightened. He also asked about the keys to the equipment yard and the office. And what did you tell him? That I need to speak with whoever was actually in charge now. Mr. Marcus always told me that if anything happened to him, I should wait for proper instruction from the legal owner. Mike met my eyes. He never said it would be Daniel. Relief flooded through me. Marcus had prepared for this exact scenario, ensuring Mike would be a guardian of the business rather than simply handing it over to anyone who claimed authority. Mike, I need to share something with you, but I need your word that this conversation stays between us for now. His expression grew serious. You have it, ma'am. I spread out the documents Patricia had given me. I own Harbison Builders, not Daniel. Not the estate. Me. Marcus transferred everything into a trust 6 years ago, and I'm the beneficiary. Mike's eyes widened as he studied the papers. Well, I'll be damned. Pardon my language, ma'am, but Mr. Marcus was always thinking 3 steps ahead. He was indeed. And according to these records, the business has been quite profitable. Under your management, a flush of pride crossed Mike's features. We've built a solid reputation, Mrs. Harbison. Steady clients, quality work, fair pricing. Mr. Marcus taught me that repeat customers are worth more than any single big job. I want you to continue exactly as you have been, I said. But I need to understand something. Daniel has been less than honest about the family's financial situation. Can you tell me about any interactions you've had with him regarding business matters? Mike's expression darkened. Several over the years. He'd come around when Mr. Marcus wasn't there, asking about cash flow, wanting to know about upcoming payments from clients. A couple times he suggested the business could help him out with temporary funding for investment opportunities. And what did you tell him? That he'd need to talk to his father. I'm not stupid, Mrs. Harbison. I could see what was happening. Last year, he actually showed up at the bank the same day we deposited a large payment from the Riverside office complex project. Just coincidence, he said, but he was mighty interested in talking to the teller about our deposit. My stomach clenched. Daniel had been monitoring the business income, probably trying to time his requests for loans to coincide with maximum cash availability. Mike, I want to ask you something, and I need complete honesty. Do you think Daniel understands how much money has been flowing through this business? Mike was quiet for a long moment, considering. I think he knows it's more than your family let on, but I don't think he knows the full extent. Mr. Marcus was very careful about keeping business and personal finances separate, at least on paper, when Daniel would ask for help. Mr. Marcus would tell him the business was struggling, that margins were tight, but then he'd find a way to help anyway, usually as a loan from the business account rather than from his personal funds. Mike pulled out his own small notebook, worn from years of use. I keep track of everything, Mrs. Harbison. It's a habit Mr. Marcus taught me. According to my records, Daniel has received payments totaling about $97,000 over the past 6 years. The number was even higher than what Patricia had shown me. That's what I mean about Mr. Marcus being smart. He'd structure them as loans on paper with payment schedules and everything, but he never actually enforced the payment terms. Daniel would miss a payment and Mr. Marcus would just let it slide. As if summoned by our conversation, I heard a car door slam in the driveway. Through the kitchen window, I could see Daniel's SUV parked behind Mike's work truck. That's my son, I said quietly. I don't want him to know we've been discussing business matters. Mike nodded and quickly gathered the papers I'd shown him. Mrs. Harbison, whatever you decide to do, you have my full support. Mr. Marcus was a good man, and he trusted you enough to put everything in your name. That's good enough for me. Daniel walked in without knocking, something that would have irritated Marcus, but which I'd learned to tolerate over the years. Morning, Mom, he said, barely glancing at Mike. I wasn't expecting company. Mike stopped by to check on me, I said smoothly. You know how thoughtful he's always been, right? Daniel's attention was already elsewhere, his eyes scanning the kitchen as if evaluating it for resale value. Actually, Mike, I'm glad you're here. We need to talk about the business situation. Mike's expression became carefully neutral. Oh, with Dad gone, there are going to be some changes. The family needs to make practical decisions about assets and ongoing obligations. I watched this exchange with fascination. Daniel was so confident, so certain of his authority. He had no idea he was trying to claim something that had never belonged to him. What kind of changes? Mike asked. Well, we'll need to evaluate whether it makes sense to continue operations or if it would be better to liquidate assets and settle any outstanding debts. Daniel's tone was casual, as if discussing weekend plans. I see. And who's making these decisions? Daniel blinked, clearly not expecting the question. The family, of course. I'll be handling Dad's business affairs going forward, will you now? Mike's voice was carefully neutral, but I caught the slight emphasis on you. Mom, you might want to make some fresh coffee, Daniel said, dismissing me as he always had when important conversations took place. Mike and I need to discuss technical details, but I didn't move. For the first time in years, I stood my ground. I'll stay, thank you. This is my kitchen, and Mike is my guest. Daniel looked surprised but shrugged. Fine. Mike, I'll need you to prepare a complete inventory of all equipment, vehicles, and current contracts. I'll also need access to the business accounts so I can assess the financial situation. I'd be happy to help with that, Mike said carefully. Who should I coordinate with regarding authorization for account access? With me, obviously, and you have the legal authority to access Harbison Builders' accounts? Daniel's confidence wavered slightly. Because I'm Marcus Harbison's son and heir, I see. And do you have documentation showing you're authorized to act on behalf of the business? The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the antique clock above the sink. Daniel's face was reddening, and I could see him struggling between irritation and uncertainty. Look, Mike, Daniel said, his voice taking on the condescending tone he used when challenged. This isn't a hostile takeover. I'm trying to clean up Dad's affairs and make sure everyone gets taken care of, but I can't do that if you're going to make things difficult. I'm not trying to make things difficult, Mike replied evenly. I'm just trying to understand who I'm supposed to be taking orders from. Your father was very clear about proper procedures and documentation. Daniel turned to me, clearly expecting support. Mom, Explain to Mike that I'm handling Dad's business matters now. I looked at my son, this man who was planning to sell my house out from under me, who had accumulated nearly $100,000 in debt while claiming his father left nothing behind, and made my choice. Actually, Daniel, I think Mike is right to ask for proper documentation, I said quietly. Your father was always very careful about these things. Daniel stared at me as if I'd grown a second head. What are you talking about? I'm talking about making sure everything is handled properly and legally. Surely you can understand the importance of that. For the first time since this conversation began, Daniel looked uncertain. Watching that uncertainty creep across his features, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Power. The phone call came at 6:30 in the morning, today's. After my confrontation with Daniel in the kitchen, I'd been expecting it. You can't challenge someone's assumed authority without consequences, especially when that someone is accustomed to getting his way. Mom, we need to talk. Now, Daniel's voice was tight with barely controlled anger. Veronica and I are coming over. It's rather early, don't you think? This can wait. We'll be there in 20 minutes. The line went dead before I could respond. I took my time getting dressed, selecting a forest green dress that Marcus had always said made me look regal. If this was to be a confrontation, I intended to face it with dignity. They arrived exactly 20 minutes later, Veronica's heels clicking aggressively on the front porch. I opened the door before they could knock, maintaining the advantage of being the hostess in my own home. Good morning, I said pleasantly, as if this were a social call. Veronica pushed past me into the living room, her designer handbag clutched like a weapon. Daniel followed, his face grim. They both remained standing, positioning themselves between me and the door in a transparent intimidation tactic. Mom, I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, Daniel began, but Mike Donnelly called yesterday and said he can't provide me with business information without proper authorization. What did you tell him? I settled into Marcus's favorite armchair, the one with the best view of the room. I told him to follow proper procedures. Your father would have expected that. Proper procedures? Veronica's voice was shrill. Daniel is Marcus's son and heir. What more authorization does anyone need? Legal authorization, I said calmly. The kind that comes with actual ownership. Daniel's eyes narrowed. What are you talking about? Dad's will leaves everything to the family. I'm the executor, which means I handle all assets until probate is settled. Actually, Daniel, that's not quite accurate. I reached for the folder I'd placed on the side table, the one containing all the documents Patricia Walsh had given me. Daniel and Veronica both tensed as I opened it. Your father's will does indeed leave his personal possessions and this house to the family, I continued. But Harbison Builders isn't part of his estate. It hasn't been for 6 years. What are you talking about? Daniel demanded. I pulled out the trust documents and set them on the coffee table between us. Harbison Builders has been owned by the Harbison Builders Trust since 2018. I am the sole beneficiary of that trust. The silence that followed was deafening. Veronica reached for the documents first, her manicured fingers trembling as she scanned the legal language. Daniel read over her shoulder, his face growing pale. This is impossible, Veronica whispered. You don't know anything about business. You never even balanced a checkbook. You're right, I said. I didn't. Your father handled everything. But apparently he understood things about our family dynamics that I was too naive to see. Daniel sank onto the sofa as if his legs had given out. But the business was struggling. Dad always said margins were tight, that there was barely enough to keep operations running. The business has been quite profitable actually. Here are the financial statements for the past 6 years. I handed him another set of papers. Watching Daniel's face as he processed the numbers was like watching someone realize they'd been playing checkers while everyone else was playing chess. These profits, Daniel's voice was barely audible. Where did this money go? Some of it went to you, Daniel. Quite a lot of it, actually. I pulled out the loan documentation. $93,000 over 6 years, to be precise. Veronica grabbed the loan papers, her eyes scanning frantically. These say loans, Daniel. You told me those were gifts. You said your father was helping us get established. They were gifts, Daniel said, but his voice lacked conviction. Dad never asked for payments. He never even mentioned payment schedules. Actually, he did, I said quietly. Patricia Walsh has copies of every conversation, every missed payment, every time your father chose to extend the terms rather than demand what you owed. I watched as the reality of their situation began to sink in. Daniel had built his financial life on the assumption that his father's generosity would continue indefinitely. He'd probably borrowed against those expectations, made commitments based on money he thought was his, but this doesn't change anything, Veronica said suddenly, her voice taking on a desperate edge. The house still goes to Daniel. That's worth more than some little construction business, is it? I asked mildly. Veronica's eyes flashed with something between anger and panic. Don't play games, Eleanor. This house is worth at least $500,000. You're right. It's a beautiful property. Of course, there is the matter of the mortgage. Daniel looked up sharply. What mortgage? Dad said the house was paid off. It was. But 16 months ago, your father took out a home equity loan. Quite a substantial one, actually. I pulled out the final set of documents, the ones I discovered in Marcus's study just yesterday, filed carefully in a folder marked Emergency Reserves. A home equity loan for $380,000, I continued. The proceeds were transferred into the Harbison Builders Trust account, which means they became part of my inheritance. Veronica's face went white. That's not possible. We would have known. We would have had to sign. Your father was the sole owner of the house at the time, I interrupted. I was listed as a spouse with rights of survivorship, but not as a co-owner. He didn't need anyone else's signature. Daniel stared at the loan documents like they were written in a language he couldn't understand. But why would he do this? Why would he mortgage the house just to put money in a business account? For the first time since this conversation began, I allowed my carefully controlled emotions to surface. Because he was protecting me, Daniel. He was making sure that no matter what happened, I would have financial security. Protecting you from what? Daniel's voice was hoarse. From this, I said, gesturing to the scene in front of me. From being thrown out of my own home by family members who saw me as a burden instead of a person. From being left with nothing while everyone else claimed what they thought they deserved. Veronica's composure finally cracked completely. You manipulated him. You convinced a dying man to change everything. Your father wasn't dying when he set up these trusts, Veronica. He was planning. And the fact that he felt the need to plan for this scenario should tell you something about how he viewed our family dynamics. Daniel's hands were shaking as he set down the papers. Mom, surely we can work something out. You don't really want to run a construction business. And this house is our family home. It should stay in the family. It is staying in the family, Daniel. It's staying with me. But the mortgage payments, Veronica said desperately. How will you afford the mortgage payments? The same way your father intended with income from Harbison Builders. Mike Donnelly assures me the business is quite stable, and Patricia Walsh says the cash flow will easily cover the loan payments with plenty left over for my living expenses. I stood up, smoothing my dress. Now, I believe you mentioned something about moving out. I think that's still an excellent idea. Not for me, of course, but I'm sure you'll find somewhere lovely to start fresh. Daniel looked at me as if seeing me for the first time. Mom, you can't be serious. After everything Dad did for you, everything our family means, your father did do everything for me, I interrupted. He loved me enough to make sure I'd never be at anyone's mercy, including my own son's. And now I understand just how much I needed that protection. Veronica was already at the door, her face twisted with rage and disbelief. This isn't over, Eleanor. We'll fight this. We'll contest everything. You're welcome to try, I said calmly. But you should know that everything your father did was completely legal and properly documented. Patricia Walsh is very thorough, and she's already provided copies of all relevant documents to my attorney." Daniel paused at the door, his expression a mixture of confusion and hurt. "I don't understand, Mom. Why are you doing this to us?" "I'm not doing anything to you, Daniel. I'm simply refusing to let you do it to me." After they left, I sat alone in the sudden quiet of my house, and felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. For the first time since I was a young woman, I was completely financially independent. I owed nothing to anyone, and no one could take away what I had. Marcus had given me more than money. He'd given me freedom. 7 months later, I stood on the deck of my new oceanfront cottage, watching the morning sun paint golden streaks across the Monterey Bay. The sound of waves against the rocks below had become my daily symphony, replacing the familiar creaks and settling sounds of the old house. The Carmel cottage was smaller than the family home, but it was entirely mine. Every piece of furniture, every decorative choice, every room reflected my taste rather than compromises. Made over 40 years of marriage, I discovered, to my surprise, that I had excellent taste when no one else was offering opinions. Harbison Builders continued to thrive under Mike Donnelly's management. He called every Thursday afternoon to update me on current projects and upcoming contracts, and quarterly profits were deposited directly into my account. I'd kept my promise to maintain the business exactly as Marcus had structured it, and everyone involved seemed happier for the stability. The cottage had been an unexpected discovery. While researching properties along the California coast, I'd learned that Marcus had purchased it 2 years ago through the construction trust. Patricia Walsh had found the deed while organizing business assets, along with a note in Marcus's handwriting, for Eleanor's retirement when she's ready for ocean air and no schedule but her own. Even in death, my husband was still taking care of me. This morning was special. My attorney was coming by to finalize the last piece of business from my old life. Daniel and Veronica had indeed tried to contest the trust arrangements, hiring an expensive attorney who specialized in elder law and financial exploitation cases. It hadn't gone well for them. The investigation revealed that not only were all of Marcus's financial arrangements completely legal and properly executed, but Daniel's debt to the business was actually larger than anyone had initially calculated. Interest and penalties brought the total to just over $101,000. The doorbell rang at precisely 10 o'clock. James Richardson, no relation to Helen from the bank, was a precise man who believed punctuality reflected character. He'd been representing me since this mess began, and his calm competence had been invaluable during the more stressful moments. "Good morning, Eleanor," he said, settling into the comfortable chair by the window that had become his usual spot during our meetings. "I have the final settlement agreement for your review." I poured coffee from the French press. I learned to use another small freedom in my new life and sat across from him. "How did they take the final terms?" James's expression suggested controlled amusement. "About as well as you'd expect." Daniel's attorney spent considerable time arguing that family obligations should supersede business contracts, but ultimately the law is quite clear on debt obligations. He handed me the settlement documents. After 7 months of legal wrangling, Daniel and Veronica had agreed to terms that acknowledged the full debt and established a payment plan that would take them 8 years to complete. Assuming they never missed a payment, they tried once more to negotiate a family forgiveness clause. James continued. "Daniel actually broke down in the final meeting, claiming that you were destroying your relationship with your only son over money. And what did you tell them?" "I reminded them that I was representing your financial interests, not your family relationships. Though I may have mentioned that most mothers don't have to sue their children to collect legitimate debts, the settlement also included a provision that particularly satisfied me. If Daniel and Veronica defaulted on payments, The business could legally garnish Daniel's wages and place liens on any property they purchased. It was a safety net that would ensure I received what was owed, regardless of their future financial choices. There's one more thing, James said, pulling out a separate envelope. This arrived for you yesterday. The envelope was addressed in Daniel's familiar handwriting. Inside was a brief note on plain paper. Mom, I know you probably won't forgive me for fighting you on this, but I wanted you to know that I finally understand what Dad was doing. It took losing almost everything for me to see how much I'd taken for granted. Veronica and I are in marriage counseling, and I'm working 2 jobs to meet the payment schedule. I'm hoping that someday you might be willing to talk to me again. I'm sorry for everything. Daniel, I folded the letter carefully and set it aside. The apology was genuine, I could tell, but it was 7 months too late and motivated by consequences rather than conscience. Any response you'd like me to convey? James asked. No. If Daniel wants to rebuild a relationship with me, he can do it the same way. He'll pay off his debt gradually, consistently, and over time. After James left, I took my coffee out to the deck and read Daniel's letter again. The grief was still there, not just for Marcus, but for the son I'd thought I'd raised and the family relationships I believed were real. But underneath, the sadness was something stronger, a deep satisfaction that I'd stood up for myself when it mattered most. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something about it seemed familiar. Hello, Mrs. Harbison. This is Claire Walsh, Patricia's daughter. I hope you don't mind me calling. I did remember Claire, a social worker who specialized in family therapy. Patricia had mentioned her occasionally during our meetings. Of course not, dear. How can I help you? Well, it's actually how you might help us. Mom told me about your situation, about how you had to rebuild your life after family difficulties. I'm starting a support group for women who've experienced financial manipulation by family members, and I wondered if you might be willing to share your experience. The request caught me off guard. I'm not sure I'd know what to say. You'd be surprised how many women find themselves in similar situations. Adult children who feel entitled to their parents' assets, spouses who hide financial information, family members who mistake kindness for weakness. Your story could help other women understand their rights and find the courage to protect themselves. I thought for a moment, watching a pelican dive for fish in the bay below. 7 months ago, I'd been a grieving widow facing homelessness at the hands of my own son. Today, I was financially independent, living exactly where I wanted to live, accountable to no one but myself. When would you like me to speak? I asked. Really? You'll do it? I think I will, but not about revenge or legal battles. I want to talk about the difference between being a loving family member and being a doormat, about the importance of understanding your own financial situation, about the gift Marcus gave me when he protected my future, even from our own son. We scheduled the speaking engagement for the following month. After hanging up, I realized that helping other women navigate similar situations felt like a purpose, a way to honor both Marcus's protection and my own hard-won independence. That evening, I did something I'd started doing every night since moving to the cottage. I sat on my deck with a glass of wine and watched the sunset, taking time to appreciate the simple fact that this view, this peace, this freedom was entirely mine. No one could take it away. No one could vote me out of my own life. No one could decide I was disposable. The cottage was quiet except for the ocean's rhythm and the distant call of seabirds settling in for the night. Tomorrow I would tend to my garden, maybe drive into town for lunch at the little bistro where the owner always saved me the table by the window. Simple pleasures that belonged entirely to me. Daniel's debt would be paid eventually, whether he managed it responsibly or the business had to garnish his wages. The legal settlement ensured that justice would be served regardless of his choices. But the real victory wasn't financial. It was the knowledge that I'd found the strength to demand the respect I deserved. As the last light faded from the sky, I raised my glass in a silent toast to Marcus, wherever he was. He loved me enough to ensure I'd never be helpless, never be dependent on the mercy of people who saw me as expendable. And he loved me enough to make sure that when the test came, I'd have everything I needed to pass it. The ocean continued its eternal conversation with the shore, and I sat in my own home, on my own deck, living my own life, finally understanding what freedom really meant. It meant never again having to beg for a place at a table that should have been mine by right. It meant peace. Now, I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever faced something similar? Share your thoughts below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen to other stories that are channel favorites. They'll definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until the end.